Gospel reading from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 43a. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up a mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there were two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. But while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and then all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him alone. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. As we celebrate the last Sunday of the church season of Epiphany, which means a showing forth, this story of Jesus' transfiguration is the ultimate epiphany that reveals so much about who Jesus is. He is a prophet above all other prophets, and he is God's beloved son. There's a lot of connections in this story with other stories from the Old Testament, as well as with other parts of Jesus' life. The appearance of Moses and Elijah connects Jesus with a long line of prophets and foreshadows that Jesus will be the one to fulfill all of the prophecies that have been made about the Messiah to come. Moses and Elijah's presence also reminds us that Jesus will be rejected, just as these and other prophets have been rejected. Nevertheless, Jesus speaks profound truth. Another connection that's important to recognize in this passage is the voice from the cloud. When the voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him," it connects back to Jesus' baptism, when a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Jesus' baptism marked a transition in Jesus' ministry. His baptism marked the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And now the transfiguration marks another shift in his ministry. From now on, Jesus will be intentionally heading towards Jerusalem. Up until now, Jesus' ministry has been focusing in on revealing that Jesus is God. Jesus had healed people, cast out demons, and performed many other miracles. Now, another side of Jesus' ministry and purpose were about to be more fully revealed. Right before Jesus and these 3 disciples went up the mountain where Jesus was transfigured, Jesus had told his 12 disciples for the first time that he would suffer. He would be killed, crucified, and would be raised on the 3rd day. And so on one side of the mountain was Jesus' liberation of people through healing and miracles. And then Jesus and his closest disciples come to the clearing on the top of this mountain where Jesus is transfigured. And now they go down the other side of the mountain, heading towards the liberation that Jesus will bring about through his death and resurrection in Jerusalem. This is the next chapter in Jesus' life, ministry, and journey. One final connection that I want to point out in this story is, besides making the connection between Moses and Jesus both as prophets, Jesus is also being depicted here as a new sort of Moses. Jesus' radiance in the Transfiguration is comparable to the radiance that emanated from Moses when he descended from Mount Sinai after being in God's presence. Moses was the one who delivered God's people to freedom. He guided the Israelite slaves out of Egypt and to freedom in the Promised Land. And Jesus, Elijah, and Moses were talking about Jesus' departure. The word used for departure could also be translated as Exodus. So Jesus' death would be another deliverance, another liberation for God's people. Jesus was about to bring about a new Exodus. And this is the good news for us. From this mountain where Jesus' power and glory were vividly revealed, Jesus turned and headed toward Jerusalem. He began to intentionally make his way to the place where he would be crucified, but would ultimately be resurrected in a revelation of his utmost power and glory. Despite all of the outward signs of death and defeat, Jesus was more powerful than death and more powerful than any political or religious powers of the world. God was present with the disciples through all of this. Jesus had walked with the disciples up one side of the mountain as Jesus tried his best to help his disciples understand who he was and why he came. Jesus was with his disciples as they were terrified on top of that mountain. And Jesus walked back down the mountain with his disciples as they continued on their way to Jerusalem. Through it all, Jesus was present with them, and God told the disciples to listen to Jesus. With all of the connections in this story that I mentioned, perhaps the most important connection is that this story is ultimately connected to today and connected to us. Jesus' glory and power continue to be revealed in our world today, and Jesus continues to be present with us. And God tells us to listen to Jesus too. And so as we head into the season of Lent, may we continue to grow in our awareness of Jesus' power and glory and his presence. Let us focus in on Jesus and listen to him. And let us be astounded at the greatness of God. Let it be so. Amen.